everybody, good evening and welcome. It's a real pleasure to introduce you and welcome you to our RHS February lecture. Well, I'd like to just go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight, Katrina Navickas. Katrina is a reader of history at the University of Hertfordshire. She's published extremely widely in the field of social British history, particularly 18th and 19th century histories of protest, the Luddites, swing rioters, Chartists, political prisoners, political clothing, and protesters' use of landscape in work that's often very innovative and imaginative. She's the author of 2 books, Loyalism and Radicalism in Lancashire, and Protest and the Politics of Space and Place. She's a recent, and no doubt was a very happy recipient of the British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship Scheme. And she's also, for this year, 2021, an Open Spaces Society Fellow at the Museum of English Rural Life. She's currently working on her 3rd monograph, which is looking at public space in England, 1700 to 2000. And it's on that theme that she's speaking to us tonight. Her paper is entitled The Contested Right of Public Meeting in England from the Bill of Rights to the Public Order Act. Katrina, welcome, and over to you.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for, Emma, your wonderful introduction. I'm really honoured to be speaking to everyone tonight. I'd also like to thank Margot Finn for inviting me to speak, and also quick acknowledgements to Sarah Lloyd, Richard Hussey, Henry Miller and Mary O'Connor for helping me with this talk. I share some honour with you. Okay, so my talk today is the right of public meeting from the Bill of Rights, the Public Order Acts, obviously a longue durée topic. The right of public meeting was a key demand of extra-parliamentary political movements in Britain and the Empire. The public meeting legitimated local elites within a constitutional process. It formed the political nation. But it could also be a site of contest, a challenge to authority. Popular politics was and still is a matter of who has the right to assemble, where. The right of public assembly and protest involve public space, policing and the law. All types of political associations in the 18th and 19th centuries claimed legitimacy to hold public meetings, often with reference to Magna Carta or the Bill of Rights of 1689, alongside the right of petitioning and free speech. Perhaps even more than petitioning, participation in a public meeting was the most common experience that the majority of the British population had of political debate and collective action before and indeed still after enfranchisement. So what was a political meeting? Its shifting definition across the 19th century is part of the factors that changed the legislation and policing of public assembly. Formally constituted public meetings were held by a panoply of institutions, including the parish vestry, and there's a satirical portrayal of a parish vestry being invaded by Isaac Cruikshank on the screen from 1828 there. A town council, Lord Lieutenancy and county meetings, gatherings of ratepayers, and after incorporation in the mid-19th century, increasingly towns meetings. They usually followed an official process called by a mayor or other official in response to a requisition from an often specified minimum number of respectable inhabitants, usually to pass resolutions, sign a petition to Parliament, or ratify an address to a monarch. Though technically restricted to the membership of that body, for example, vestry and ratepayers, in practice, usually anyone could turn up, and the restrictions were only enforced in times of party political conflict. Unofficial public meetings were just as ubiquitous, called by acclamation or advertisement, and just as mixed in their participation. The mass public meeting held outside in town squares or marketplaces, or inside in civic and commercial buildings, often still abided by the ritual processes of an official meeting, with speakers, committee, resolutions, amendments, and voting. Open public meetings often shaded into other types of gatherings, from demonstrations, electoral hustings, and rallies. I'm not going to go into depth here into the technicalities of how meetings were requisitioned, and there's current research being done on this by Richard Hussey and others. This talk rather is about the development of the idea of the right of public meeting and the fuzzy boundary between that and public assembly, and where the debates sit in the narrative of a developing constitutional polity that was participatory but not democratic until the 20th century. And the very definition of right is at the heart of the ambiguities and complexities that make this particular to England and its legal system. A crucial point involved the debates around the right of public meeting, which is a paradox. The English legal particularity number one, and there will be more in this lecture. There was no right of public meeting in England and Wales, not until the Human Rights Act 2000. As legal scholar David Mead has highlighted, although the right of free speech was evident in case law by the late 19th century, precedents for the right of public assembly were much more fragmented. And as 21st century protests have illustrated, are still very much contested. Contemporary legal scholar A.C. Dicey recognised this ambiguity in his article on the right of public meeting in the Contemporary Review of 1889, published at the height of the crisis about the policing of socialist meetings in Trafalgar Square. Dicey basically answered his own questions here by concluding that there was no clarity in either common law, statute, or legal precedent. Even if a meeting started out as lawful, that is, with permission of the authorities, a small breach of the peace would transform it into an unlawful assembly. What Americans usually refer to as the law of the governing the freedom of assembly is generally applied in the English context to the law of public order. And this distinction between the two and the tensions they cause are at the crux of the whole narrative. And in reaction to a growing idea of the right of public meeting, governments made successive attempts to legislate against, police and control public assemblies from 1661 onwards. I'm not going to go through all this legislation in detail, but I'll start with essentially that 1661 is the first modern act to regulate petitioning to Parliament. But essentially governments relied on the common law of tumultuous assembly until 1795, when the rise of the democratic working class platform necessitated the passing of a Seditious Meetings Act. This was a turning point. The working class democratic movement was seen as a major threat. So this is the story of how public meeting came to be perceived as a legally protected right rather than just a liberty, and how national and local authorities regarded the right and policed it. I'll come back to legislation later, but these are the key themes of the talk today. What we'll be doing is challenging perhaps an idea that, particularly in the 19th century, liberal governance takes over, and in fact arguing that there's a sustained independent radical tradition that continues through these challenges. And I'd like to focus on three paradoxes, one of which I've already mentioned, the paradox between rights and liberties to meet. Secondly, I'll be looking at what I call the Parks paradox, the right to air and exercise. And thirdly, the highways paradox, the right of passage along the King's Highway. I hope to rethink where we are in terms of 19th century studies and revise older narratives of the relationship between Parliament, governance and people in this period of reform. The role of the public meeting in the history of political culture in Britain isn't, of course, an entirely new argument. social movement theorist Charles Tilley saw the rise of the public meeting, by which he meant the mass platform demonstration, of which you can see an example there, Henry Hunt proclaiming in front of the crowds at Smithfield in 1819. Tilley saw this as the key part in the democratisation of British popular politics. His was a progression thesis, optimistic about the potential for direct participation in non-violent, parliament-focused forms of popular action. Historians in the 1990s, notably the New Political History, were a bit more pessimistic. They focused on searching for ways of understanding the place of political meetings and debate in an era of an extending franchise. They considered the middle decades of the 19th century in particular as a battleground of ideas between emerging liberalism and more militant claims by radicals to represent the people. They strongly argued for constitutionalism as the populist discourse that subsumed, if not vanquished, the language of class that Marxist depictions had previously identified as the politics of the people. They also posited a Foucauldian liberal governance model of the relationship between local elites and the state in policing and control in the 19th century, a dominance of middle-class civilizing and sanitizing morality. But to what extent did the relationship between the people and the variety of political structures of which the public meeting was a part change as the franchise expanded? And did a populist civilizing liberal discourse really dominate over a class-based polity? I seek, if not to challenge these optimism versus pessimism teleologies, then at least to see rather fluctuating patterns and localized differences over the longue durée. I argue against previous portrayals of the long 19th century as an increasingly exclusive and homogenous political culture. Rather, the contests over the uses of public space for political meetings demonstrated the continuance of an independent radical tradition and an active working class politics separate from middle class liberal governance. Studies of 18th and 19th century Britain and its politics have fragmented somewhat since the 1990s, preferring to focus on individual political movements within a short time frame. I'd like to return to a longue durée approach. Indeed, more recently, a scholarly revival in interests in petitioning has spearheaded this return. The footnote for this sentence, you won't be able to see it, but the footnote on my page takes up half the page with a voluminous number of articles published in the last few years on petitioning here and in the colonies. The research on petitioning shows how it was a vital part of popular politics from the 1640s right through to the turn of the 20th century. One of the important findings of the petitioning research is that there was a notable shift in how the right of petitioning Parliament was framed. Whereas earlier in the period, petitioning was claimed as an inherent right in itself, by the later 18th century, there was, to quote Mark Knights, an increasing tendency to view the right to petition as part of a group of mutually supporting rights, the most important of which were the right to assembly and the right to freedom of speech and print. I argue the coalescence of the idea of the right to petition with the concept of the right of public meeting and free speech was an ongoing process of assertion of popular rights. Moreover, petitions were a major reason for public meetings, but they were not the only one, and not the only purpose or result of them. There were many other types of political meeting and assembly, as we will see, that were just as essential to sustaining and contesting different relationships with the idea of the constitutional state. So let's start with some debates about the rights of public meeting. The first paradox, the conflation of right with liberty. There's a distinct chronology to the debates around the right of public meeting. Using the text mining tool of Hansard at Huddersfield, we can track the uses of the term in the parliamentary debates from 1803 onwards. The first instance of the term right of public meeting recorded in Hansard post-1803 occurred in a House of Commons debate on the 21st of December 1819 on the blasphemous libel bill, which was part of the 6 acts following the Peterloo massacre. Lord Ebrington, a consistent supporter of the Whig opposition against the Tory measures against popular radicalism, denounced the bill, claiming Parliament had already restricted the right of public meeting. But the term was already frequently employed in, as the new political history has taught us, the constitutionalist discourse of popular radicalism and indeed liberalism before 1819. I'll come back to this graph later, so don't worry, you'll see it again. But here we have popular movements employing the rhetorical tropes of Magna Carta and the 1689 Bill of Rights to justify the right of public meeting. Yet the Bill of Rights only protected the right of petitioning, the Crown, and did not guarantee the right of public assembly. From the 1780s onwards, these historicist frameworks were combined with Lockean Enlightenment and Thomas Paine's notions of absolute natural rights, though of course these rights were implicitly confined to the freeborn Englishman and not women or colonial indigenous subjects. Pitt the Younger's government's 2 acts, passed against seditious meetings and widening the remit of treason in 1795, aroused the most nationally widespread response, pretty evenly balanced, it seems, between petitions for and against the legislation. And the resolutions of hundreds of meetings of vestries, towns and counties were all handily collated in this massive tome, The History of the 2 Acts. I've not calculated exactly, but I'd estimate around 3/4 of the petitions against Pitt's measures liberally employed the Whiggish rhetoric of claiming the right to public discussion or meeting as protected by the Bill of Rights. As you can see there from the county meeting in Northumberland, just one example. Whether this was deeply felt ideology or just more tactical in speaking the language of Parliament to convince, it nevertheless entrenched that connection. The 1817 and 1819 Seditious Meetings Acts passed in reaction against the revival of the mass platform and the debates around the legality of the Manchester meeting that became the Peterloo Massacre was a discourse enacted in Parliament and in the various trials of the radical leaders, and it sought to delineate and divide between the officially called public meetings and the mass platform rally. The ultra-loyalist reaction to Peterloo, most extreme in this pamphlet by Sir Codrington Carrington, chair of Buckinghamshire Quarter Sessions, with all the melodrama he could muster, questioned the right of the people to use acclamation and consent to form a public meeting, rather than through the official channels of requisition to the respectable local elites, although that was exactly what the Peterloo radicals had done, with deliberate attention to procedure and legality. The imperial frameworks are also important in understanding the actions of elite authorities in the domestic context. Carrington had made his mark serving as former Chief Justice of Ceylon, preparing their code of laws, which he also did for India, and he had a large estate in Barbados. By the time of the Chartists in the 1830s, the idea of the right, however it originated, was well established in radical discourse and was continually defended in print and on the streets. This is a poster from Bradford from 1848, which claims as the Constitution guarantees the right of public meeting. At his trial for seditious libel in 1839, William Lovett, Secretary of the Chartist National Convention, made a speech to the jury disclaiming the dispersal of the Bullring mass meeting in Birmingham at which he was arrested. And he noted as illegal and unconstitutional attack has been made on the right of public meeting, and be it remembered this right is broadly admitted and generally established by the fact of petitions emanating from such meetings being recognised by the legislature. Counter-argument by the prosecution focused on the definitions set by older legislation and common law, arguing the meetings in the Bullring were not constitutional meetings, but tumultuous assemblies. The magistrates interfered with these meetings because they were called upon by the peaceable inhabitants to put them down. Yet as crowds employed tactics of defiant orderliness, following the rituals of organised meetings, local authorities increasingly assessed the assembly itself, rather than whether it was violent or used seditious words, as the illegality itself. This was especially the case for Chartists in Sheffield, who enacted the innovative tactic of the silent meeting for several evenings in 1839, after they'd been banned for attending church. Silence overturned the expected oral experience of protesters occupying public space, that is, noise, speeches, music. After 4 evenings of silent meetings, the magistrates issued a placard prohibiting public meetings in the square and sent in the police to disperse the crowds. Under the definition of Seditious Meetings Act, causing fear among the respectable inhabitants was a measure for the authorities as to how seditious the meeting was, rather than had been the case before the words spoken on the hustings. Okay, let's go back to the chronology. The right of public meeting as a term did not register regularly then until the Second Reform Bill about the Hyde Park meetings disturbances in 1866-7. Radical movements continued to quote the constitutionalist idiom. As Anthony Taylor has pointed out, most radicals preferred to employ the more elastic tropes of Anglo-Saxon freedom rather than follow Reform League leader and lawyer Edmund Beale's approach of forensically challenging the specifics of legislation that prevented them from meeting in Hyde Park, and I'll come back to them later. With a couple of peaks around the Fenian disturbances in Ireland in 1871 and 1882, 1888 was the year for parliamentary debates on the right of public meeting, with the largest number of speeches debating or prominently mentioning the term, of 44 speeches in 1888, and the greatest frequency of the use of the term in the debates. The Social Democratic Federation, or the SDFs, challenge to use of Trafalgar Square and other sites in the capital in the 1880s led to a proliferation of debates, publications, trials and legal judgments on whether the right of public meeting existed or had precedent. Much of the historiography of the debates, particularly of this 1860 to 1880 period, is centred on London. Understandably, the spaces of Trafalgar Square and Hyde Park naturally attract the historiography. London's popular politics in relation to public meetings was unique, spatially because of the layers of authority and direct connection to the centres of power. The Metropolitan Police and Special Constables were under the centralised direction of the Home Office. Chartists in 1848 and the Reform League in 1866-7 thus directly confronted the apparatus of central government power in the seat of authority. Key turning points in the London situation were the 1844 Trafalgar Square Act and an 1877 Act authorising the Metropolitan Board of Works to control and manage parks and commons and make bylaws, including against public meetings. Secondly, the appointment of Sir Charles Warren as Metropolitan Police Commissioner in 1886, who then implemented a more militaristic form of policing and enforced a ban on public meetings in Trafalgar Square, leading to the Bloody Sunday attack on socialist meeting in November 1887. The radical agitation in the capital was therefore strongly confrontational, as it was direct to power. The socialists in particular sought to make these contests into caste conflict, rather than sticking to polite liberal discourse, although they did revolve their debates around legality. Warren had only been recently decorated for his service following the eponymous Warren expedition in South Africa, and had been appointed commander in the Sudan before being recalled again to take up the post of Metropolitan Police Commissioner. So his immediate experience, which he transferred to policing the capital, was shaped by his colonial rule. I'm not entering into the debate about imperial policing here, but in a wider sense, historians cannot ignore the imperial framework that the leading characters were working within, and something I need to do more on, especially the context for the suppression of the Irish public meetings at this time, and also the 1907 Prevention of Seditious Meetings Act in India. In the various debates, many Liberal MPs argued that public meetings were safety valves for the masses. Cunningham Graham was a Liberal turned Socialist MP for North West Lanarkshire, and he was one of those arrested at Bloody Sunday for unlawful assembly. Upon his release from prison, he introduced the Public Meetings in Open Spaces Bill on the 13th of July 1888. The bill proposed an absolute and inalienable right of public meeting in open spaces that had been used for at least 20 years for that purpose. The local authorities could regulate such meetings in the spaces they controlled, but they could not be, quote, in restraint or prohibition of the general right of public meeting or freedom of speech. The bill was therefore intended to be the first piece of legislation to actively recognise a general right of public meeting. The Public Meetings Bill and other associated bills specifically to do with Trafalgar Square failed to pass. The somewhat convoluted parliamentary debates about the bills also failed to resolve the question of the right of public meeting. The result was that rather than finally having definitive legislation and guidelines about such rights, the police and local authorities were left on the ground, to quote Ian Channing's study of this, using ambiguous and ill-defined powers under the breach of peace doctrine to marshal public assemblies. I'd like to just have a little diversion here into Sheffield because, as I stated, much of the historiography here is London-based, and I've been working on a database of public meetings in the various industrial cities. So let's move to the West Riding of Yorkshire and Sheffield, a site of long-standing radical democratic and trades activism. I gathered records of about 550 political and public meetings from 1788 to 1936, text-mined and manually extracted from a range of sources. Those are the spaces that are available. And one of the things that struck me actually in the debates about the Public Meeting Bill of 1888 was comparison was always made with the industrial cities and saying that London had a lot more range, had a lot fewer range of spaces available to public meetings compared with particularly the industrial cities in the north. Actually, when you look at Sheffield as case study, that's not true. They actually had a very restricted number of spaces. And what I found out was that 20% of the public meetings in my sample were official, that is called by requisition and agreed by the master cutler before incorporation and then by the mayor after incorporation. 7.5% were unofficial and disallowed by the authorities, and the rest were, it's unclear, but certainly that they called them by advertisement, but there's no official permission was recorded. Public meetings were pretty constant during the 19th century. There is a burst in the Chartist period, partly due to my counting of open air Chartist meetings there as public meetings. And I've definitely underestimated the number and frequency of meetings in the later part of the period. Most meetings were called by requisition to the master cutler before incorporation and to the mayor after incorporation. And we also see patterns in terms of where they're held and the types of meetings that I'll show you in a minute were important at different stages of the period. But intriguingly, my main finding was that only 18% of these meetings produced petitions or addresses, and 82% didn't result in a petition or an address. This has implications for the research on petitioning, but also for Charles Tilley's progression thesis that contentious gatherings became more parliamentarised or parliament focused. So quickly, I'm just going to skip through the layers, but this shows you how actually quite limited Sheffield was for places. In the 1780s to 1820, local government and loyalist meetings dominated public meetings at the time. In 1820s to 1850s, it was radical and then Chartist meetings, although with a caveat that I've probably focused on them too much. In the 1850s to 1880s, election meetings and international issues, particularly the Eastern question, dominated. And in the 1880s to 1914, Home Rule was the dominant topic of discussion. The majority of the open air meetings of all kinds were held in Paradise Square. Its multi-party use was one of the more unusual features of Sheffield's spatial politics compared with other industrial cities. I've already mentioned the silent meetings in 1839. Paradise Square continued to be the site of political meetings throughout the rest of the 19th century. From the steps of the Freemasons' Hall on one side of the square, Isaac Ironside, the firebrand Chartist and socialist local councillor, in a mass meeting in April 1848, same day as Kennington Common, declared, "This flight of steps belongs to the people. This square belongs to the people." The square didn't belong to the people. It was owned and controlled by the trustees of Shrewsbury Hospital, and permission was required from the master cutler and then the mayor to use the square. What's interesting compared with other cities is that permission was usually given. The square was the venue for the reform demonstrations to campaign for the Second Reform Bill in 1866-7, and the rallies of the unemployed in the 1880s, including in the most tumultuous year of 1888. So I'd like to move on to that period and the second paradox of rights that became important in the 1860s with the emergence of the Reform League, coinciding with the Victorian public parks and commons preservation movement. There's two paradoxes of common rights, as I've mentioned, and the first one from the 1860s onwards is the claim to the right of public meeting was increasingly complicated by an actual common right, the right to air and recreation in public spaces, what I'd call the Parks paradox. Edmund Beals's challenge to use Hyde Park before the Reform League riots was discussed in the conservative Sheffield Independent in 1864. The editor noted, "Nobody wants to interfere with the right of Mr. Beals's people to hold open-air meetings, but unfortunately Mr. Beals's people want, or at least he says they do, to interfere with the rights of the people in general to the parks. Unless listening to a speech of Mr. Beals's can be fairly described as public recreation, the parks are not kept up for him to address meetings in." Parks were more regulated than street spaces and in effect a form of enclosure of former commons, the most notable being Kennington Common in 1853, if not directly then certainly indirectly in reaction to the mass Chartist meeting there in April 1848. And this immediately meant more restrictions through use of bylaws and internal policing through wardens, and so it ends up looking a bit more like that. The Royal Parks in London had banned political meetings, and that had led to the Reform League's agitation over Hyde Park. And the 1872 Parks Regulation Act reinforced the ban. In 1880, the agitator and commons preservationist John de Morgan led the legal challenge against the Metropolitan Board of Works' new powers to enforce bylaws against political meetings. Corporations and councils across the country quickly followed suit with their own bylaws and amendments to park regulations, although the extent was varied in that some chose to ban meetings entirely, while others, including Sheffield, set out a process of requiring permission, in effect replicating the process of requisitioning of the authorities in urban public meetings. The Parks issue thus, through De Morgan in particular, became indelibly linked with free speech and the working class movement against the enclosure of the last of the metropolitan commons. As Anthony Taylor and Mark Gorman's studies have emphasised, using modes of resistance that do not fit the political schema of Tilley's progression thesis or the new political history's emphasis on liberal governance. A compromise was enacted in the London parks with specific sites being allocated for London meetings. But as you might see with Kennington, public meetings there were relegated to outside the boundaries of the main park on a small triangle of ground between the tram lines. The local authorities probably realised the symbolic significance of letting them meet in the main area of the park in echo of 1848. Outside London, the battles over the use of the parks for political meetings depended on the level of reaction by the local authorities who controlled them. The Boggart's Hole Clough case in Manchester was perhaps the most instructive of the contests over the parks, as covered by Peter Gurney in an excellent article in Manchester Region History Review. In 1896, the Manchester Parks Committee took over the management of quite a rugged space north of Manchester called Boggart Hole Clough, and immediately prohibited the meetings of unemployed strikers who'd been meeting there. The cause was taken up by a cross-labour alliance of the SDF, the ILP and Trades Council, who challenged the prohibition, both by holding meetings there and in local elections, facing a contest with the chair of the Parks Commission, who stood for election. This reflected translocal solidarities, and I think reflects Raymond Williams' notion of militant particularism and connecting the local with much larger solidarities. Parks were quite late to be laid out in Sheffield, so it's not until relatively late that the SDF used the parks in Sheffield as their background. During the 1908 to 1909 campaign, several SDF orators, including women, were arrested and fined for delivering public addresses in the parks. It became a deliberate tactic to raise publicity, and Justice, their newspaper, actively called for volunteers to break the bylaws by giving speeches. In July 1908, for example, Daisy Halling spoke in High Hazels Park, Sheffield, to a crowd that the newspaper alleged was about 8,000 people, and she was later charged and fined £3 at the police court. But notably, these contests were framed as free speech more than the right of public meeting. Free speech was also the cry of the SDF in other battles for the streets, and this leads to my third and final paradox of English common law, the highway obstruction paradox, that the horse and cart has more right to the street than a group of people. This issue became crucial as the form and sites of public meetings changed. Excluded from the parks by bylaws and from public halls by costly hire charges, socialist, trades and unemployed groups used street corners as their meeting sites from the 1880s onwards. Dodd Street in Limehouse in the East End was the key site chosen deliberately to test the right of public meeting by the SDF. But this was policed not through more legislation, but through common law of obstruction. The 1835 Highways Act, Section 72, for those taking notes, gave police an extra tool in enforcing the right of free passage against obstruction. The number of tried cases does not represent the frequency of the use of obstruction because the majority of uses were unreported, tried at petty sessions or just enacted on the ground by police. But what happened here was it was beginning to distinguish between stationary and moving crowds, although there's precedence obviously in the Chartist processions, which was to become even more significant as the century went on and processions became privileged above static assemblies on the street and the highway. Obstruction of the highway was increasingly used because it allowed the police to be discretionary. It was a highly malleable concept as opposed to the statute law, and it enabled the authorities, both the police commissioners and the Home Office, to claim that they weren't discriminating against particular people, but rather were vindicating the public right of free passage. So we get to the sort of, again, more paradoxes. When is a square not a square? Court judgments on Cunningham Graham after his participation in Bloody Sunday determined that under the Trafalgar Square Act of 1844, the square was a thoroughfare, and therefore the police were right to clear obstructions from it, though the police commissioner's permanent ban on meetings in the square was not deemed as valid. Fining the SDF and other groups for holding lectures and meetings on street corners and in unlicensed halls was increasingly common. There's examples from every town in Britain from 1880s to 1914. In Birmingham in 1908, the treasurer of the Unemployed Association was charged with obstruction for addressing a meeting in Chamberlain Square, the main civic area outside the town hall. In Sheffield, local debate centred on whether political and trades groups could continue to use the monolith, a monument that had been erected for Queen Victoria in 1877. Like the parks, the contest was couched again in terms of free speech. And in 1914, Sheffield City Council prohibited public meetings held at the Queen's Monument, ostensibly on safety grounds because of the rise in traffic. The decision was opposed by all major activist groups, from the Sheffield Trades and Labour Council, ILP, Socialist Fabians, WSPU, and Women's Labour League. So here we move to nuisance and annoyance as a key way of understanding the later 19th century state, rather than a Foucauldian model of liberal governmentality. A key continuity of all the debates, particularly over the uses of public and civic space, was the protection of private property. The role of property owners and ratepayers in defending their property is paramount. David Churchill, crime historian, and others have argued convincingly that better than moral reform or civilizing, nuisance and annoyance capture the spirit of urban ordering under the police in this period. As Constant Bantman's study of policing of anarchists in London in the 1880s has shown, popular protest was recast as antisocial behaviour. The key shift was the issue of parades rather than meetings, however. Charles Bradlaugh, the freethinker and instigator of much of the parliamentary debate about the right of meeting, inevitably blamed the Salvation Army for fomenting the problem. In a piece titled On the Right of Public Meeting in Annie Besant's freethinking journal Our Corner in 1885, he noted the difficulties created by riotous opposition have been of late years enhanced by the outraged proceedings of the Salvation Army. The key legal cases involved the Salvation Army, whose parades were harassed by publicans' anti-temperance skeleton army in many towns, particularly on the south coast. The attack on a march at Weston-super-Mare ended in an important legal case, Beattie versus Gillibanks, in 1882, which concluded that the processions could go ahead and that police should protect them against interruption. The result of these cases was that marches and processions were legally distinguished from public meetings as separate and as exercises of the right of passage along a highway that deserved legal protection. So I'd like to finish with the shift to the 20th century very briefly by saying that actually the Sally Army and even the SDF were an easy target for police, but they weren't actually threatening the state. It was a problem of local public order rather than an issue of overturning the system. What started to change things in the early 20th century was a different form of protest. Firstly, the militant activism of suffragettes, which went much further than the street demonstrations of the SDF and the trades. The WSPU developed specifically disruptive tactics of interrupting public meetings and heckling speakers. In 1905, notably, Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenney were ejected from a Liberal meeting at the Free Trade Hall for heckling. They organised their own meeting outside and the police arrested them for obstruction. But obstruction was not enough to police these sorts of interruptions. And the Public Meeting Bill of 1908 was presented to Parliament by the Conservative MP Lord Robert Cecil. The bill sought to create an offence of disorderly conduct at a public meeting by anyone intending to prevent the transaction of business. Notably, the response to the bill among the Liberals was mixed and centred around whether the measure would defend free speech at meetings or suppress it. The Public Meeting Act also did not solve the issues of the duties and actions of police at such meetings, which varied across different districts. So finally, we move to public order, and I'm conscious I'm skipping ahead, but needs must. Marching became the main problem in the early 20th century for the state, much more than public meetings, with the issue that had just been established in those Salvation Army cases of the protection of the right of passage and bridling with issues of fascist and racist harassment. Section 54 of the Metropolitan Police Act 1839 was increasingly used in the interwar period as the rival meetings of the fascists and communists became the main concern for public order. The rise of the race question with fascism coming into prominence in the 1930s led to more specific public order legislation against marching and racially incited speech. The 1936 Public Order Act, rushed through Parliament in the wake of the Battle of Cable Street, provided the police with the power to prohibit processions in advance. But it did not legislate on static political meetings. And despite the primary concern of fascist violence, there was a prevailing attitude that the bill needed to protect political speakers and prevent organised public disruption of political meetings. More problematic was the definition of public meetings held in private premises, and there was a committee on this in 1909, which noted that if a public building is hired or even lent to an association or another section of the public for the purposes of meeting, it becomes in law for the time being a non-public place. This definition caused immense problems of policing the fascist rallies of Oswald Mosley in the mid-1930s, particularly at Earl's Court. And debates over whether the police had the right to enter and intervene were not resolved until the amendments to the Public Order Act in 1967 in response to the race riots and hooliganism, which sought to extend the definition of public place to include indoor privately owned venues. So to conclude, this is my proposed simple guide to the chronology, from tumultuous petitioning and assembly to seditious meeting to the devolution of the legality of public meeting to obstruction and nuisance, free speech and public order. We do see a shift to a devolved liberal governance in the sense that no specific statutes against public meetings passed from 1819 onwards, but it was a messy and patchy form of governance rather than Foucauldian channels of power. The dominant battles were fought over nuisance and annoyance in the streets. The devolution of decision-making was no longer possible, however, in the 20th century with the rise of suffragette militant tactics and the fascist marches in the 1930s, which led to much stronger public order legislation. But it's important to remember that that public order legislation from 1936, but also 1986 and 1994, focused on the rite of passage still, and were much more specifically aimed at groups seen to be a threat to the state who were using obstruction. It was exclusionary against, for example, the 1986 acts were aimed at minors and travellers, and up to 1994, there's a whole debate and legal cases around whether Stonehenge is a cul-de-sac or a right of way. But it's not until 2000 Human Rights Act that the right of public assembly was defined in statute, and recent debates, notably about the Metropolitan Police Order against Extinction Rebellion, holding protests in any area of London in 2019, and the various iterations of restrictions of public gatherings around the current emergency health regulations have again brought the issue to the fore. And for more on these, do see legal scholars David Mead and Adam Wagner, who are constantly updating these changes to the regulations as they stand. So I'll finish there.
Thank you so much. Yes, you can see some comments coming already in the chat. Thank you, Katrina. Welcome back, everybody. Katrina, do you want to put your camera and your mic back on? Lovely. You're the person everybody wants to speak to see. So some questions are coming through the chat. As you can imagine, I've got many questions I'd love to throw at you myself, Katrina, but why don't I turn to the chat instead and let other people pose some questions to you. So I've got the first question coming in from Becky. Why were they so against allowing free and open public meetings? What was the benefit of isolating and imprisoning those who tried to participate in these things?
Okay, so again, that shifts across the period. So prior to the French Revolution, actually, the government really didn't particularly care about large public meetings in terms of legislating against them. It just wasn't an issue. And even during the American Revolution, the association meetings were allowed to continue. I mean, they were slightly concerned about the more radical Westminster Association, but essentially they start becoming worried once the Gordon riots actually create a large amount of destruction of property in London in 1780. But it's only really from the 1790s that legislation is passed against public meetings because they regard them as seditious. And it's partly fear of revolution, it's partly fear of large numbers of working class people being imbued with these seditious democratic beliefs. And that continues right until the 1850s, really, as an attitude from the elites, local government, as well as from national government, in terms of it's a bad idea to get large numbers of people together in urban spaces. It eases with the extensions of franchise, but it's still problematic. And I do think that once the suffragettes start their campaigns of militant violence, it becomes a problem again for the state. So it depends on whether they feel that property is under threat. It also depends on whether they think the state is under threat. And there is that lull, but even the Hyde Park riots in 1866-7 are problematic for the government, partly because they're so near to Parliament.
Thanks, Katrina. So, Jamie Bronstein, can you say a little more about the restriction on torchlit demonstrations or processions specifically? Was there something specific about nighttime that made these demos frightening to the political class? Or was the issue just that occurring after work hours, these meetings could more easily be attended by working people? Oh, fantastic question.
Yeah, they mainly occurred in October, November, so it was already dark by about 4 o'clock. And also people are starting bonfires for bonfire night anyway, but it was a deliberate tactic on the part of the Chartists to show a sense of force in the kind of very orderly way. So there's always that tension between a show of force that's orderly to show kind of an intent. So the Royal Proclamation is November 1838, and it's partly again because property owners are fearing arson. It's not that long since the swing riots of the early 1830s, which had burnt property. So they are seen as a threat. Actually, what diminishes the frequency of the torchlit meetings is that Fergus O'Connor decides that it's too risky to continue the tactic, and he tries to dissuade the rest of his followers not to undertake the practice. But it's partly a kind of ritualistic sort of customary form of show. It's also quite striking as a form of protest, particularly the ones in northern England, because they're coming down from the hills, so you can see the highlights of the torchlit. It's quite a spectacular type of protest. But yeah, it's seen as dangerous to property.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question I'm going to read out is from Paul Reedman. Thanks for a fascinating paper, he writes. The story you tell is a very urban one. What about rural contexts? What was the response to expressions of rural radicalism in rural public spaces, Joseph Arch, red and yellow vans of nationalisers, etc.? What comparisons and distinctions can be made? Many rural radicals were, of course, much exercised by issues of access to space and, of course, motivated by the legacy of the lost common.
Okay, Paul knows a lot more about this than I do, but if I'd tried to put the commons preservation agitation in this, it would have been a 2-hour paper. So I decided to focus on urban because most of the legislation focuses on urban spaces, in particular Trafalgar Square and the parks. So there is a parallel story going on here with the rural radicals who are enmeshed in this fight for commons preservation. Again, we've got to ask ourselves, what is public space in rural areas? Actually, there isn't any public space in rural areas. Even commons generally are privately owned. So there is a continual battle, and there is a growing movement for land nationalisation. But it's a parallel story rather than one that necessarily intersects. The only times it really intersects in the view that I've looked at is when John de Morgan pops up at an urban meeting, and he does do tours of the urban and said, look what's going on your moors or in your commons. So there is a story to tell, but the government seems less bothered about. Rather, they seem that the real threats are in the urban areas where it's much greater threat of but you know, the socialists or the anarchists who are on the doorstep, rather than actually quite a minority interest looking at campaigning for land nationalisation.
Thanks, Katrina. Yeah, I just say when I was working on sports and pastimes, the difference between urban and rural was always really striking, and the same activity taking place out in the countryside didn't exercise anything like the same kind of anxiety as it did in an urban space. Our next question is from William Farrell. 2 questions. He says, was Sabbatarianism ever used against public meetings in this period? And have you found any differences between England and Scotland?
Right, I know nothing about Scotland, which is why I've deliberately put England in the title for today. So I'm sure that Gordon Pentland and other Scottish historians of this period can enlighten you. But Scotland has a different legal system that does influence this. I think that England and Wales's common laws are quite important in the story I've told today. So I'm sure there are differences. Sabbatarianism comes through most particularly in temperance movement and debates around whether you should be allowed to have any meetings at all or anything at all on a Saturday, so on a Sunday in parks in particular. But I think it filters more generally into those debates over temperance and temperance processions and when are they held. There's lots of debate over whether any sort of activity should be held on a Sunday anywhere. So it does fit into much more broader debates about urban governance and what behaviour is respectable and what isn't. But it's more to do with temperance, I think, rather than specific Sabbatarianism.
Lovely, thanks. Got a next question from Mariana Dudley that picks up what Paul was asking about, really. I think, wonderful lecture, thank you. She says, could Katrina fit more recent protests and gatherings such as road protesters, Swampy, etc., up in trees rather than on the streets into this history, the occupation of more rural spaces?
Yeah, I ran out of time for that, but I did have a longer section on the 86 and 94 Public Order Acts. And as I said, those are targeted or framed very much around excluding people who are nomadic or not seen as part of a property landscape. So there is specific targeting of travellers, new age travellers, environmental protesters in the 86 and 94 legislation. And in particular, the Stonehenge cases is fascinating because, again, it's mainly environmental protesters and new age travellers who are contesting the rights to use Stonehenge. And the case revolves around whether Stonehenge is a cul-de-sac or a right of way. And again, that links in with current plans at the moment about reworking where the road should go. So the argument is if it's cul-de-sac, then you have the right of meeting there because you're not obstructing the right of way. So a lot of the 20th century legislation is very exclusionary against people who are not seen as part of a propertied or at least a traditional English or British state. So it also targets specifically gypsies and travellers and other groups that are seen as marginal.
So fascinating. I have to say, I just love the way that you're bringing in the spaces and the speeches, which kind of makes sense to bring the history of speech and history of space together, but that kind of transport and rights of way and is, you know, it's a really different angle. I've never kind of put the whole lot together before. With questions are coming in quick and thick and fast, Katrina, so I'm just going to fire some more at you. Jim Greenhall, I wonder if Katrina would say more about how she conceived of nuisance and obstruction as being antagonistic to liberal governmentality or Foucauldian analyses. It seems to me that the two positions could be reconciled in various ways.
Yeah, I mean, my argument really is that I don't disagree that there are channels of liberal governmentality. You know, the government is trying to regulate things, and local governments are always trying. Civic improvement is an ongoing process, but it's never finished. It's very messy, very patchy. It sometimes goes backwards as well as forwards, and so part of these debates over spaces are also entangled in those bigger debates of who has the right to use public space. So regulations of prostitution and vagrancy and all those messy things that annoy liberal governance are never complete. So some of the older literature seems to suggest that it wins, that we get these channels of power from the centre to the locality through quite neat and tidy urban improvement and bylaws. But actually, there's tons of bylaws in the late 19th century which are regulating every aspect of people's lives. But the more bylaws you have, means the more people are breaking them. And I think that particularly the socialists and the suffragettes are particularly conscious of that and are using that and have agency using those loopholes and battles with police over obstruction as their main battleground. They don't need to sort of tackle legislation that the earlier radicals in the Peterloo era or the Chartists had to do. It's much more battles on the ground. So hopefully they can coexist, but it's never complete.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Thank you. Next question from Emma MacLeod. Katrina, that was wonderful. Thank you. Do you have any sense that the authorities felt any sense that they were restricting public rights when they clamped down on public assemblies?
Yeah, I mean, there's the big debate really, particularly amongst the liberals later on, about free speech, and that free speech is generally associated more with, you know, it's seen as something that should be protected. So you get these kind of contradictory J.S. Mill type debate over what liberties should be protected and what should be intruded on. So in the debates over freedom of meeting, there are lots of contrasting voices which are saying this is increasingly clamping down on free speech. Also, the debates over petitioning as well, you know, where the right to petition is seen as the crucial right, really. And throughout this, I think government, you know, I'm not saying that we've got this massive repressive government. We don't, compared with the continent. They are desperate to keep an element of legality and particularly protect what they see as well as the right of petitioning that is in Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights. It is seen as a kind of as a given. So it is difficult, but I think they realise they see the freeborn Englishman as the person that needs to be protected, and that freeborn Englishman generally is a propertied white male in England. So not in Ireland, or well, yeah, in Ireland against you know, the Fenians or whatever. So it is a sort of, that's why I like to use the word paradoxes, because I think, you know, there's contradictions in this that even the greatest philosopher of the time can't resolve.
Lovely, thanks. I'm going to skip down to another question, which I think actually follows on really nicely from that, from David Phillips. A brilliant talk. Thank you very, very much. But you haven't referred to the position outside the UK, presumably autocratic on the continent and in the colonies, and much more, well, autocratic and much more democratic in North America. So, yeah, encouragement.
Yeah, again, if I had 3 hours, and people who read this talk for me told me to take the colonial stuff out. So I did have a load of stuff. And it's something, again, I've liked to have done a lot more on the imperial context. And again, because of the current situation, it's quite hard to do the research on that. There were massive debates about, particularly the India bill, and there's an anti-seditious meetings bill it passed in India in 1907 for India, and it's ironic because a lot of the literature that I've seen coming out of India by, you know, colonial writers is saying, oh, India's this land where, you know, the English brought the freedom of the right, freedom of speech and all these nice laws to India. So it's kind of, again, the kind of propaganda coming out of the colonial elements in terms of the British Empire. It contradicts actually what's going on the ground. As I mentioned, a lot of the people writing the laws then end up as police commissioners and MPs in Britain. So they're influenced by those colonial currents of thinking about how do you enforce colonial power. But there is also that sort of distinction between us and the French or the Prussians, and we're always being compared with, look at the Kaiser and how repressive he is. So again, English history in particular is full of lies, basically, in terms of how we enforce restrictions on public meetings on our own people and on colonial people compared with the continent. But it's definitely something that needs a lot more work.
Lovely, thanks ever so much, Katrina. So Chris Parry brings us back to the local, and he asks, how did local customs and precedents over the use of space affect the right of public meetings?
Okay, customs and locality is something I love because I think we ignore it. And although I've only looked at London and Sheffield in this talk, everywhere is different. So some areas in particular have local customs and local places that have often, have always been used for public meetings. Other places there are lots of contests over their use. I know a lot about the history of Manchester in particular, and those areas, again, a lot of the spaces are much more contested than they were in Sheffield. And I picked on Sheffield, and I started the Sheffield data last year thinking, oh, I'll just use this as a case study example that reflects the contested spaces. But actually, annoyingly, I found more continuity than change in Sheffield, in that Paradise Square was used for all sorts of political meetings all the way through the period. And there are some contests, particularly when Isaac Ironside, who is the kind of the character of the time, Chartist, then becomes a socialist. He's always banging the drum, but essentially the Sheffield authorities, pre and post incorporation, are generally let things happen as long as it doesn't result in confrontation, which is what happened with the Sheffield Chartists in 1839. So each town will have its own story. Each town will have its own customary areas where public sort of meetings are permitted or not permitted. It really depends on the local authorities, who's in power, who's on the local council. And I think that's pretty regular throughout the 19th century, at least, in terms of, actually, I don't think as much change as we might think pre and post incorporation.
Great, and there's another question. There's a question from David Steele, actually, that kind of carries on very nicely, I think, from that. He says, considering the reform period mass platform, would you say that the definition of what constituted unlawful assembly was left to local interpretation and therefore open to partialism and abuse, and became a political tool of the elite? What you might call the outsourcing of oppression to the regions?
I mean, unlawful assembly is always used because it's common law and it's in the Justice of the Peace Guide, and the police use it. I mean, it's such a fuzzy term anyway, and tumultuous. What's tumultuous? I think one of the stories, again, that contradicts the idea that we've got this kind of liberal governance and centralising authority is that there's, again, regional variations between police forces or magistrates in how they react to public assembly. And tumultuous assemblies as a common law offence is part of that. Part of the story I've told is it actually becomes more usual to use obstruction and the Highways Act to disperse meetings, much easier than using the Riot Act, although that is still used.
Thank you, Katrina. I'm going to nip over to a question from Robert Poole, who knows us a lot about this as well, and just think you may well find interesting. He says, terrific paper, Katrina, a big picture clearly mapped out. It prompts a comment about the changing meaning of public in this context. In the early 19th century, public bodies, boroughs, vestries, townships were assumed to have a more limited legitimate membership and purpose, and their assemblies had to be properly authorised, constituted and peopled. By the late 19th century, public effectively meant everyone. So was the standard of a public meeting shifting? I'd be interested in your thoughts about possibly changing assumptions behind the definition of the public here. And could this apply to public land too? But that's another question, he says.
Thanks, Robert. I've been having this conversation all week with Richard Hussey and Henry Miller, who are working on petitions, and you're welcome to join us in this long conversation. I think there is a shift, but again, it's a messy shift. So you do have a much more restricted emphasis on vestry meetings. Select vestries in particular become much more limited in the early 19th century. It's a tool of almost reactionary tool by local elites who are trying to defend their traditional corners against an increased enfranchised population. But I think that the two coexist. You still have, in my Sheffield data at least, you still have formally constituted public meetings, which are done by requisition. So one of the distinctions, and again, it's something that I know Richard Hussey's working on, which is requisitions, is that increasingly after the Seditious Meetings Acts, it becomes accepted that you could also call the public meeting through advertisement in the newspapers, as long as it's requisition to the local authorities. It kind of becomes equivalent to a physical requisition letter to the magistrates or whoever's in charge, and those carry on through. I'm certainly on the Sheffield data. I need to look back through my Manchester data, but they continue right through the 19th century. So what I found in my data was what I call official meetings, which are the ones that happen in the town hall, or are officially called if they're larger in an open space, continue at the same time as the mass rallies. But obviously mass rallies become fuzzier in the definition, so they include electoral meetings. That's what I've included, electoral meetings, in my data. They include home rule meetings, which generally are organised by the Liberal Party but aren't necessarily organised by the mayor. But I still find that permission is still required for these meetings, and certainly with the Parks meetings, my source for that were the Parks Committee books, which is where people are explicitly asking for permission, again, according to the bylaws. So those processes are still occurring, even though the form of the public meeting might be changing or becoming much more inclusive.
Such rich material, Katrina, thank you. A question from Angela McShane. Really great paper, many thanks. How did authorities prevent public meetings that they launched themselves, i.e. proclamation readings, public executions or drinking events, celebrating civic elections, etc., from becoming tumultuous assemblies?
They couldn't. Again, it's something that I always teach the students, that one meeting ends up as something else. Again, there is this emphasis order and emphasis on the process, on the requisitions, on the reading your standing orders, but making sure that there's a committee and that there's some sort of policing, even if it's kind of temporary constables. But there's a lot of these meetings just end up in a night of violence, particularly if it's election time or there is drink taken.
Yeah, fantastic. Jonathan Morris, can you explain a bit more about the role of the Master Cutler in Sheffield and why he had a say over the authorisation of public meetings?
Yeah, before incorporation, which I think is 1853, takes a while, the Cutlers Company is the main authority in Sheffield, just because they're the dominant guild. So members of the steel industry are the main freemen and the main trustees. There is a trustee act, I think is 1792, and the majority of the board of trustees for Sheffield are on the Cutlers Company. So the Master Cutler, who still exists, look at his website. It might be a lady cutler at the moment. They're just the authority, again, by long-standing tradition. There is a battle over incorporation with different interests, but as much of the literature on the Sheffield politics has shown, it's much more about personality politics rather than party politics. And so there's a few years where there's to-ing and fro-ing over incorporation, but essentially once the mayor's elected from the 1850s onwards, the town's still dominated by the Cutlers Company, perhaps less so than it has been, but it's a kind of upper middle class dominated polity, really. The aristocrats are in the background, so the Duke of Norfolk controls quite a lot of the common land and the parks around Sheffield, as does Earl Fitzwilliam, and they stick their nose in sometimes, but generally it's the Cutlass Company who run the place.
Fascinating, thank you. From David Mead, Katrina, thanks for such a splendid talk. Do you have any sense of whether the purposes of gatherings changed over time or among groups, and or whether that might have informed state responses? Thinking here that it might be intimidation through size of numbers, proselytizing to third parties, developing what we'd now call group solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue that public meetings are always thousands of people sometimes. I don't think there's an increase in size other than in relation to the population. You can have county election meetings of large numbers in the 18th century. So I don't think it's an issue of larger size, although there's always debate in the papers about how big a crowd is. But I think it's more, again, which groups are putting forward those. So the government is mainly concerned about the democratic movement in the 1790s, the working class democratic movement. It's mainly concerned about agitators for home rule in the 1860s, 1870s, mainly concerned about the SDF in the 1880s, and then the WSPU in the turn of the century. So it's who's shouting loudest at different stages in this longue durée.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, I've got two questions from Peter DeSena and Andrew Hobbs that I'll put together because they're both about football. So Andrew just asks how football crowds dealt with, and Peter DeSena more lengthily asks about the FA and, well, really about the fact that crowds could always be disorderly and actually also political. So I'll ask you to address
I know
that.
nothing about football, I'm afraid, dear listeners. So I can't answer. I mean, I will answer. I saw another question about did assemblies become more orderly, and essentially the progression thesis that Charles Tilley put forward, and is still quite influential in a lot of historiography, is that crowds become a lot more centred on directly addressing Parliament. Actually, what you find looking at the lists of what the public meetings are about and what crowds are about, again, this links also with Reedman's point about rural crowds, is that a range of issues are always on the table, and that crowds use the threat of violence quite skillfully. They're not orderliness does not necessarily mean that they don't threaten violence, and they might use violence if it's appropriate. So riot is still a problem, particularly in trades disputes, against strikebreakers and those sorts of things. There's a different story to be told about government's attitude to picketing and that tactic, which is another thing. And that's why the militancy of the WSPU becomes a problem, because they then have to think about should they use the trade union laws against picketing, against women picketing town halls when Winston Churchill comes along, which they do. So it's about how violence is used rather than crowds becoming more orderly.
Brilliant, thank you. As we are rapidly running out of time, I don't think we're going to get through quite all of the questions, but just one or two more we'll try and squeeze in. There's one from Laura Forster here. Again, she really enjoyed the paper, and a question about regional variation. So she points out that in London there's more choice of places to meet, and so when you're kicked out of one place, there's potentially somewhere else for you to go, and how that might differ from rural, more provincial places where there's actually much more, less of a choice of spaces to meet. If you've got kicked out of one, you're running out of options.
Yeah.
That?
Again, Laura's more of an expert on London than I am. But what struck me, and I mentioned this briefly and I had to take it out of the talk, was during the debate on the public meetings in open spaces bill, loads of MPs were saying, oh, you know, there's no space in London. No one, you know, that all the East End MPs in particular were pushing for government to actually state sponsor a site for public meeting in London. Which obviously is quite utopian and never happened. And Charles Bradlaugh writes it. And these sort of ideas that everywhere else has got lots of places to meet becomes a kind of trope in a lot of the parliamentary debates. And they used Bradford as an example. And I've got these quotes about them saying, well, Bradford's got this big hall that can accommodate 6,000 people, whereas the biggest hall in Shoreditch is 2,000, and the population's much greater. And then I looked at Bradford. Again, sorry I didn't put this in the talk, but I looked at Bradford in 1888, and there's a massive battle over the use of St George's Hall and Forster Square. Ironically, Laura, that your name is embodied in the square. And they're banned, you know, SDF are banned from using these spaces in these sites. So you're absolutely right in terms of there are places, again, it depends on the political tenor of the local council, that just prohibit groups from meeting in these traditional civic spaces like squares or town halls. And that's why the SDF and the WSPU start meeting on street corners like Dodd Street, because those are the spaces that are used. So although I use Dodd Street as the main example, because that's what the historiography focuses on, I can find examples from most places of police courts fining SDF members for meeting on street corners. It's everywhere.
Fascinating. All right, I'm going to put two questions together, as I'm sure this will be the last one we have time for. So Andrew Fro-Jones has asked, very roughly, how did attendance numbers change from, say, Sparfield's meetings in 1860s to the 1880s? Were people more or less willing to attend due to the risks involved? So I think there's a question about size and change over time. And Peter Mandler has asked, where do you stand on the old question of whether public meetings were becoming more orderly, not just more parliament-centred, over the course of the 19th century? So just a couple of questions there about change over the 19th century in terms of size and orderliness.
Yeah, I think I've answered those already, but to repeat that, first, I think that, again, orderliness is a measure that is done by the authorities, and that crowds choose threats of violence, or at least threats of disruption, throughout this period. They become more orderly. I don't think that's the case. Certainly when you look at the militancy, say, of suffragette crowds, there are chosen tactics. So I don't believe crowds are necessarily spontaneously violent or disruptive. There's always an order, and that's why, particularly from the 18 teens mass platform onwards, there is a strategy, very orderly, kind of deliberate threat it's almost more threatening to be orderly than it is to be riotous, because the government can't, you know, local authorities can't predict what you're going to do. So I do think it's not a simple progression from riotous to orderly. And the size, again, I think the big meetings in the 1880s, 1890s, and even, you know, in the 1930s, huge meetings, large numbers of people. Again, the population's increased of industrial cities, so it's relative to that. But I think it's still, you know, going to a big demonstration is still a big attraction throughout this period and today.
Yeah, thank you, Katrina. I cannot thank you enough. I think I haven't managed to get through all of the questions, but the sheer number of questions that have come in and the range really speak volumes to how fascinating and inspiring I think people have found your paper. And I could just say the same thing myself. It really just brings together so many different things to think about, and it's been a real pleasure to listen to. So I'd like to thank you. I don't think I can get the whole audience clapping now that we're over on the webinar system, but I'm going to clap. I think the whole audience is at home secretly, quietly clapping, and would love to join me in thanks for what's been an absolutely fantastic paper. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who's come and joined us this evening. It's just fantastic to see so many people from all over the world. It's brilliant. It's amazing. We have more lectures coming up soon, so do come back and join us next time. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.